Hey guys, I'm Kendra Perry from kendraperry.net, and today we're going to discuss the differences between the two types of stool testing that you may encounter with your clients. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of both and which ones you should be using in your practice. So basically, you have two different main types of stool tests that are being used today. We have a traditional stool test versus a PCR DNA test, and they're actually incredibly different. They're like comparing apples and oranges. So let's start with the traditional stool test. So this is typically what's going to be run in a doctor's office. Labs like Doctors Data and Genova, kind of those main really popular labs, tend to use a more traditional stool test. And a traditional stool test uses a type of technology called microscopy. And basically what this involves is that stool is sent to a lab, and in the lab, a lab tech is going to put the stool into a petri dish and observe what grows after 24 hours. So after 24 hours, depending on what grows, that's how they can determine if there is growth of an organism. So in order to be found, it needs to grow, and the lab tech can identify it. This is a little bit different than what's called a PCR, or polymerase reverse chain reaction / DNA test. So basically there is no human component in this type of test. There's only a machine, and the machine is identifying microscopic DNA of various organisms that might show up in stool. Okay, so there are pros and cons to each. So let's start with the traditional stool test. So obviously the limitations of this type of test is the fact that you need to be able to actually culture or grow this organism in a petri dish. So what does that mean for organisms that don't actually thrive in oxygen, right? Because there are certain organisms that are anaerobic, meaning that they thrive without oxygen. So those types of organisms are probably really not going to survive after leaving the human body, because once they're exposed to the oxygen, they're going to kind of self-destruct, downgrade, and disappear. So typically, anaerobic organisms actually can't be cultured because they're not going to grow in stool, because they are actually dying once they leave the human body. A traditional stool test also relies on things showing up regularly or being shed regularly in the stool, and also being present in fairly abundant amounts, because they need to be fairly present in order to grow in that petri dish. So a really good traditional stool test isn't just going to do a one-day collection. They're going to do a 3 or 4 day stool collection. So that means that your client has to poop in a tube 3 or 4 days, and that's going to increase the likelihood of finding something, right? Because certain things may not be shed regularly in the stool in abundant amounts. So that is definitely a con to a traditional stool test, especially if you're doing a single day stool collection, which is very typical in doctor's offices. They might just do a single day stool collection and it comes back negative, even though the client or patient may actually have some significant infection, but it just, for whatever reason, wasn't shed that day in the stool, or it was anaerobic, so it died before it made it to the petri dish. So the benefit of this type of test is that as long as it grows, it can be found. So the lab tech doesn't need to be really looking for anything specific. It just can observe. He or she can just observe what grows after 24 hours. And if it grows, we know that it's there. So that's kind of the benefit and pro and con of the traditional stool test. It can find anything as long as it grows, but it may miss certain things. And then of course, this is also going to be problematic for clients struggling with constipation, right? Because going every day for 3 days may not actually be happening. That might be really hard for them to do. So they might not even be able to collect that type of collection because they are so blocked up and they are so constipated. So let's talk about the PCR DNA test. So this is a more cutting edge type of technology. It's newer. It is FDA approved, so it's not just some hokey witch science, but technically it is a more sensitive test. And the reason for this is because there is no human component looking through a microscope. So it takes out that human error component. We just have a machine. And the machine is looking to identify microscopic DNA of organisms. So that means that it doesn't need to be an aerobic or organism that thrives in oxygen type of species, right? Because if it's anaerobic and it dies once it leaves the human body, as long as those DNA strands are there, it can still be found. So that is a great benefit to the DNA test, is the fact that you will pick up things whether they are aerobic or anaerobic, or even if they're dead. Because this type of test is a machine looking for very, very microscopic DNA of infections, they don't need to be present in very abundant amounts. They just need to be shed in the stool, and even if it's a very small amount, maybe just a single strand of DNA, that will be enough for the test to detect that organism. So I would say there's a great benefit to the PCR DNA test because it does tend to be more sensitive and it will pick up things that a traditional stool test tends to miss. So for example, Candida is really hard to find on a traditional stool test because it's anaerobic. So is Entamoeba histolytica, which is a very dangerous parasite, and so is Giardia. These things are actually not commonly found on a traditional stool test, a microscopy test, even if they're present. Versus the DNA PCR test, they do tend to be found. I see these things quite often on that type of test. But of course, with any test, there is limitations. With the PCR DNA test, it can only find what it's looking for. So because it's a machine, a different DNA sequence is given for each of these organisms, and that's what the machine is looking for. So if the machine doesn't know to look for it, it won't be found. So that means that, if there's a certain parasite or bacteria, the machine's not looking for it, you're not going to find it. So that's definitely sort of the drawback or the con of working with a DNA PCR test. So which test do you run? Well, I would say ultimately, the best case scenario with your client who is super rich and wants to spend all the money, you would just run both tests because they are like apples and oranges. They're looking for different things. They use very different detection methods. So they're going to identify different things. But most of your people probably are not going to be able to afford that. That can be really expensive. That's probably going to run someone like $1,500, if not more. So my personal preference is to go with the DNA PCR test. I love the GI map. I love running this. It's definitely the Cadillac of gut testing because there was a time where I used to run more traditional stool tests with clients. And what I would find in so many cases was that I had these clients who had so many GI issues. They just had gas and bloating, and they had inflammatory bowel conditions. They had autoimmune bowel conditions, but I wasn't really finding anything on the traditional stool test. So this was very confusing and it didn't make sense to me. So once I started running with the PCR DNA test, there was several clients that I did run both on. And in every case, the GI map, which is the test I was running, which is the test I still run, was picking up infections, and a lot of times the other traditional stool test was missing them. So I always go with the DNA PCR test. I do find it tends to uncover more things, but with any test, stool testing included, there's not really a test out there that's going to give you 100% of everything that could be going on in the gut. So the gut is a very complex environment, and if there are certain things that could be in a person that may not be getting shed at regular intervals in the stool because either they're there in really small amounts or they're kind of hiding in the deep dark corners of the intestine. So of course, there is no perfect test, and that's why it's always important to follow up with retesting. I like to stick with apples and apples and oranges and oranges. So if I test with a GI map, I always want to follow up with retesting of a GI map. If it's a traditional stool test, I want to follow up with that retesting because they're not the same. So you want to retest with the same method that you originally tested with. So that's the big difference between the two. I hope that has made things more easy to understand. And if you want to get my gut testing freebie, where I go through some of the differences of between the traditional stool test and the GI map, I also tell you about different blood chemistry markers that can indicate that you should do testing for the gut with a client. That's in my little gut freebie, which I link to at the bottom of this video. And if you want to learn more about me, my website is kenderperry.net.